My name is Cerise Malik. I am Professor of Media and Culture here at Brunel University, and I'm also the Associate Pro Vice-Chancellor for Research Impact. Culture wars are battles between authoritarians and libertarians over what should constitute the behavioural norms of society. Well, in America, these have been fought largely between the religious right and secular liberals. In Britain, dividing lines are just as likely to be over attitudes to the monarchy, social class, and national identity, including the rise of Englishness. So it's fitting that today, on St George's Day, and with the London mayoral election looming, that we unpack some of the increased potency of culture wars. Speaking about the culture wars, for many of us, is a complex exercise. On the one hand, to pay attention to something that feels already amplified and indeed weaponised can make one feel complicit in fanning the flames, the risk that we are also actively culture warring. On the other hand, the culture wars have real socio-political effects. And I say this on the day that the government's Rwanda bill to deport asylum seekers has passed Parliament and is set to become law. The culture wars, what they are, how they operate in society, and what implications this has for us here in the UK and more globally, therefore requires our critical attention, and that's very much the focus of this evening. We're going to begin with a lecture from Professor Nick Hubble, followed by a panel discussion with experts across different so-called battlegrounds of culture wars, and finally move to questions and answers. So I would really like to encourage you to all think about questions that you might want to ask the panel later on in the evening. A very quick housekeeping announcement. No tests are expected this evening, but in the event that an alarm does sound, please calmly follow our stewards out of the building to the meeting area. So we're going to start with Professor Nick Hubble, who is Professor of Modern and Contemporary English at Brunel. They are the co-editor of the BCCW's Decades book series, published by Bloomsbury. Nick's other books include Mass Observation in Everyday Life, The Proletarian Answer to the Modernist Question, and Growing Old with the Welfare State. They currently hold a very prestigious Leverhulme Research Fellowship to investigate self-reflexivity, class consciousness, culture wars, and social change in Britain. So a real expert on the issues that we're going to be discussing. From this project, Nick is well placed to provide the historical context and set the scene for the current and possible future scenarios in culture wars. I'd like to welcome Nick.
Thank you. Right, so here we are on St George's Day, and the St George I think about in relation to England is George Orwell. So let's move on to George Orwell. You don't have to read all of that, it's just an example of Orwell writing about England. In the 1990s, I was interested in the English radical tradition, represented by people like Orwell, as the basis for a new confident cultural consciousness within Britain. Therefore, I researched and wrote a PhD on him and social change in England at the beginning of the Second World War. I mean, as you can see in The Lion and the Unicorn, Orwell claimed that a revolution had taken place and that a new form of English life was spreading along the concrete roads and the naked democracy of the swimming pools in Slough and Hayes and Uxbridge. He didn't actually say Uxbridge, but he certainly knew this area very well. It was one of the areas he was talking about. These were the social changes that led a few years later to the 1945 Labour landslide victory and the establishment of the welfare state. It seemed to me at the time that something similar was possible in the second half of the 90s with the rising support for New Labour and their promise to focus on the forgotten suburbs and young working families. When I started my PhD part-time in 1996, I had 2 children under the age of 4, and my wife, who is German, was also doing a PhD part-time, and we were both working part-time. it was hard, but there was a sense of optimism for the future to come. On the evening of the day of the 1997 general election, we went to an election party, and soon after the polls closed, Birmingham Edgbaston declared their result, and the winner was the Labour MP, Gisela Stewart, if you give her German pronunciation of her name. And she got up and made a speech. And at this party, a man who was actually standing next to my wife shouted out, "She's a," expletive deleted, "German," much to the embarrassment of the hostess of this party. And of course, I mean, this is a memory that comes back to me many times, and it's kind of heightened by the fact that Gisela Stewart went on to be a very leading campaigner for Brexit and was the chair of the Vote Leave kind of movement. At the time, we just laughed this off, and I went on pursuing my ideas of radical English possibilities through a series of conferences on Englishness in the early 2000s. However, I kept running up against two basic problems. One problem was that lots of progressive people I spoke to just were simply not interested in Englishness in any way, shape or form. And the other problem was whenever I was at these conferences, it always ran into somebody or other who would say something negative about Europe. If we're going to join Europe or something, and then this is at a point where, we joined the EU in 1973, and as a matter of fact, geographically, of course, Britain has always been part of Europe. So I kind of got fed up with Englishness and stopped doing that and moved on to other research interests. I lost interest in Englishness, but it didn't lose interest in me. It continued to grow as a point of identification, becoming what the academics Ailsa Henderson and Richard Wynne-Jones describe as the motor force behind the remaking of British politics over the last decade. In particular, Englishness lay at the heart of the decision to leave the EU. Now, I promise I'm not going to linger on Brexit, but it's impossible to understand the culture wars in the UK, and in particular in England, without thinking about Brexit. Like an estimated 90% of academics in the UK, I voted to remain. Not only did we lose the referendum, but we got called the metropolitan elite and described as rootless anywheres rather than authentic somewheres, or as Theresa May put it, I was a citizen of nowhere. From the press, I found out that I'd been living in a bubble with people who all thought the same as me, which was, very weird because I knew a lot of people who did vote leave. My best friend in academia did vote leave. So did my dad and a number of my close relatives. So did half of the friends I still have from school. So did other friends we have. So did parents of my youngest son's school friends, and so on and so on. And that's because basically people don't live in bubbles. Not in the UK. There are not very many people at all who live in a bubble. So it's just nonsense made up by the press. Nor, I should add, have I irrevocably fallen out with or stopped talking to any of these people. Why would I? It's not that I hadn't always been aware that I thought and felt differently about certain things than them. Like most people with a high level of education who come from a background of a family with a relatively low level of formal education, I've learnt to negotiate two sets of what sociologists now call feeling rules. Even so, what happened in 2016 and afterwards was both a shock and not easily comprehended. It made me turn to the map to try and work out and understand what had happened. There were only 3 regions in the UK, and we know which voted in favour of Remain. Northern Ireland, Scotland and London, although of course Hillingdon was one of the 5 boroughs that actually voted to leave. One might think, I should say actually, the vote in Wales was very close. It was only about 70,000 people that voted, that tipped Wales over into leave. So therefore, the actual vote to take us outside of the UK was the English vote outside London. More precisely, as it says here, 85% of those who identified as English, not British, were leavers, as were fully 2/3 of the people who feel more English than British. By contrast, over 60% of those in England emphasising a British identity supported Remain. One might think, OK, those in Britain who identify as British tended to vote Remain, while nationalists tended to vote leave, but that wasn't the case either. Because in Scotland, Remain became associated with support for Scottish independence. In Wales, as we can see, you possibly can't see, but the data's a bit small, but I'll summarise, it's a little bit more complicated because a significant proportion of the population just consider themselves to be English anyway. But voters who identify as primarily Welsh voted predominantly to Remain, and then you see that large yellow chunk of the Welsh-speaking heartlands of Ceredigion and Gwynedd. While those who identified as British tended the other way, with those identifying as English in Wales overwhelmingly voting to leave. In other words, the vote to leave the UK was driven by English-identified voters in England and Wales and British-identified voters in Scotland and Wales. For Londoners or others in England who think of themselves predominantly or exclusively British, your views do not align with those of the predominantly or exclusively British in Scotland or Wales. Your views are actually closer to the views of those who feel predominantly or exclusively Scottish or Welsh. The interesting thing, though, about Englishness is it doesn't function like Scottishness or Welshness, in that by and large it's not expressed through support for national parties and independence. Rather, as Henderson and Wynne-Jones point out, it's expressed by support for institutions, symbols and values such as the monarchy and the NHS. Now, these are British institutions, but they're viewed by those who ascribe to a sense of English identity as theirs, as English in all but name. In other words, those voters who identify as English are happy with an England-dominated Britain, a Britain that's dominated by England, the way it is. Therefore, they want the current parliamentary version of Britain to carry on as it is. This was the sovereignty that the English voted for in 2016, I found myself thinking, and it was the expression of a particular kind of culture war, a deep historical culture war, not the shallow one of the clickbait headlines. I mean, these are all around us. So these are just from the last month. So from the left, you've got The Guardian saying the war on universities is a culture war. In the centre, the Financial Times proclaims that we can end the culture war because a recent report, Finding a Balance, by the think tank More in Common, found that there was a widespread support by a ratio of 5 to 1 amongst the British public for equality, diversity and inclusion initiatives. Finally, on the right, we have an opinion piece from the Times proclaiming the rise of culturenomics, which is a term for cultural debates which have an embedded economic cost. So, for example, 80% of Britons believe that climate change is happening, but once the issue is framed in economic terms, who pays for implementing net zero, it suddenly becomes a much more divisive debate, and that's why there's been a sort of rise in support for delaying or abandoning meeting that target. 10 years ago, we wouldn't have seen articles of this sort framed in terms of the culture war. Culture wars, however, did rise to prominence very quickly after that point. According to researchers from King's College London, newspaper articles focusing on the existence or nature of culture wars in the UK rose from just 21 in 2015 to 534 in 2024. The right-wing press, seeing the left as overstating the existence of culture wars in its obsession with identity, while the left-leaning press tends to depict the right, including the current government and Prime Minister, as weaponising cultural issues in order to distract attention away from the woeful economic state of the country. And these tweets are from the Telegraph and the Mail this year, just showing the sort of random nature of stories that they can attach culture war to. However, despite the fact that left and right view culture wars from a different perspective, it's fair to say that overall British public opinion is still fairly sceptical. The fact that in America, culture wars seem to revolve around evangelical Christian issues and hot-button topics such as abortion, which are not significant factors in the UK, leads some to suggest that any idea of a culture war must necessarily be an input from the US that should be best avoided. But that's actually easier said than done, because culture wars aren't only over race, abortion and evangelical Christianity as in the US, there are different issues that have triggered these kinds of divides in the UK, such as Brexit and Scottish independence. Nevertheless, in Britain, the traditional approach has been, where possible, to politely ignore such social and cultural divisions and brush them under the carpet when no one is looking. No culture wars, please, we're British. The textual equivalent of trying to brush an inconvenient truth under the carpet is to place quote marks around it. We don't have culture wars, we have culture wars, which are something underhand that the other side is doing. In 2021, the already mentioned think tank, More in Common, published a whole report, Dousing the Flames, explaining why culture wars are un-British. Because we have peaceful agreement in Britain. We don't have troublesome protests like on the continent. Because culture wars are in large part an American concept, and because when we asked Britons what they thought most summed up Britishness, they said queuing. I must admit that when I read this report in the course of my research, it was with some disbelief at both how simplistic this argument was and how much it replicated what is called British exceptionalism, the idea that Britain is inherently different to other countries in terms of being uniquely balanced and therefore more inclined to compromise. The highlighting of queuing in particular is both bizarre, because it's not true that people don't queue elsewhere, and also problematic in that it suggests the role of British people is to wait patiently while, in the words of the report, Britain's leaders act as the stewards of cultural change in Britain. But that isn't the story of cultural and social change in Britain. Changes in people's lives, from votes to women to paid holidays, were not by and large dispensed by benign leaders in a judicious manner, but gained by people themselves through vigorous debate, campaigns and struggle. Moreover, the story even in the 1930s is of people trying to develop their own lifestyles for themselves, as Orwell said, along the concrete roads and naked democracy of the swimming pools. Today, the right-wing press would describe those campaigns and that behaviour possibly as culture wars being fought by people with no connection to the wider British public, who will be described as content with Victorian conditions. In other words, complaining about culture wars is itself a form of culture war in some respects. Let me give another example of that. So here we have some books by Matthew Goodwin and David Goodhart, names that anyone who looks at the politics shelves in their local Waterstones will be familiar with. Both push a similar argument, that a new graduate elite are responsible for imposing double liberalism, that's social liberalism and economic liberalism, on an unwilling British public. Audaciously, Goodwin claims that the rise of this elite takeover can be dated from 4th of May 1979, with Margaret Thatcher introducing economic liberalism, which was reinforced in 1997 by Tony Blair and compounded by his unleashing of radical cultural liberalism. Leaving aside the fact that Blair, who advocated compulsory homework, ASBOs, argued that rights were dependent on responsibilities, wasn't actually all that culturally liberal. You know, the idea is just sort of ridiculous anyway, because it's not the same people weren't pushing economic liberalism as were pushing social liberalism. In fact, the idea of a new graduate elite imposing liberalism from top down was originally an American neoconservative idea from the 1960s. So it's not new, it's just something that's been pulled back out of history and sort of dusted off and used again. And what you have in these books is Goodwin and Goodhart both arguing to some extent that the reason culture wars are happening now is because it's a response to, you know, this new graduate elite imposing their values over the last decade. And this is kind of, you know, it's therefore forced sort of people to resist against it. In fact, they argue that this imposition of elite values has created a backlash. David Goodhart actually even defines backlash as something that naturally occurs. You know, if you push people too far, a certain number of them will become violent and angrily resist it. And according to him, that means that you've actually gone too far and you should row back and you know, take that into account as though it's a kind of natural feedback route and not just people, you know, being violent and hateful for the sake of it. Now, like everyone else, I've spent the last 10 years trying to make sense of what is happening around me as Britain has gone through a series of bewildering political and social convulsions. I finally come to the conclusion that yes, we are living through a culture war, but not this shallow clickbait idea of culture war in the media, but rather a deeper, more historical form of the culture war specific to Britain and to England in particular. However, because we like to pretend that we don't have culture wars in Britain, it's necessary to first have a look at America, where there is an acknowledged and to some extent agreed history of the culture wars, so that we can see what such a history looks like. Now, the term culture wars began appearing in the US press in the late 1980s. It became fully established following the publication of the sociologist James Davison Hunter's 1991 book, Culture Wars, The Struggle to Define America. The idea of culture wars was quickly cemented in politics by a speech by Pat Buchanan at the 1992 Republican National Convention, in which he proclaimed, "There is a religious war going on in our country for the soul of America. It is a cultural war as critical to the kind of nation we will one day be as was the Cold War itself." Now, Buchanan had previously been Ronald Reagan's communications director during the 1980s, and before that he had worked as a speechwriter for Nixon during the 1960s and 1970s, during which time he coined the phrase silent majority. The idea that there is a large mass of people who keep quiet but who have a deep moral attachment to conservative social norms, which remains the model used by conservative politicians for claiming that they enjoy popular support when they have got no other means of actually proving that they have this popular support. It's fitting that this term from the 1960s is still around because the origin of the culture wars which came to dominate American society lies in the 1960s, when the counterculture and the student new left changed America and American culture in what can be understood as a social revolution, led by a new generation not content to live in the same way as their parents had. The result was not just an explosion of popular culture, Woodstock, etc., but movements, Black and Chicano power, women's and gay liberation, and the establishment in the universities of influential programs for Black studies, Chicano studies, ethnic studies, and women's studies. As the historian Andrew Hartman argues, the identity-based movements of the 60s underscored new forms of knowledge and created new ideas. Identity was something to be stressed. It was something to grow into or become, and thereby liberate oneself from discriminatory cultural norms. In this respect, the 1960s created a new structure of feeling. A lot of people who talk disparagingly about identity politics don't understand the emotional satisfaction and fulfillment involved of being able to grow fully into yourself. These ideas of self-discovery and self-actualization were popular and quickly merged with existing social democratic traditions in society and could be seen as already winning the culture wars by the 1990s, if you could use the term win. The term actually exploded into popular consciousness through the authoritarian Christian right trying to fight back against that secular liberalisation of America. Feminism was arguably the most successful of these movements, upending gender roles which have been seen as straightforward matters of fact. These were not the values of a metropolitan elite imposed upon an unwilling silent majority. Millions of ordinary Americans had come to terms with the legacies of feminism, the sexual revolution, and a more expansive sense of identity, and had come to see those who opposed such changes as reactionaries who stood outside the American mainstream. In fact, and this is important in comparing the experience of the UK with that of the US, the exceptional state when values were passed down from the top was the normative post-war America from 1945 to 1963. Hartman, who's the historian of the culture wars, characterises normative Americans as those who prized hard work, personal responsibility, individual merit. They lived to stringent sexual expectations. Sex was confined to the parameters of heterosexual marriage. Normative Americans believed in ways consistent with strict gender roles, without men worked inside the home and women cared for children inside it, normative Americans believed their nation was the best in human history. This conformist period of history was characterised by the strict adherence to rigid social norms, social solidarity, full male employment and rising living standards. It was seen in some quarters as a golden age, and remains as such in the nostalgic remembrances of many. While the new social movements of the 1960s challenged the old social norms, new economic conditions, exacerbated by the 1973 oil crisis and subsequent recessions, put paid to both full employment and rising living standards. The attraction of the Christian right in this context to those unprepared to embrace the possibilities of the new social movements and a more fluid sense of identity was it provided an alternative structure of feeling reminiscent of that golden age of normative America. In other words, it allowed people to feel the same way about themselves as they had in the immediate post-war decades. Because in the community of the church, the American church, the social solidarity and traditional gender roles could be maintained, and subsequent generations, children and grandchildren, could be brought up in the same milieu. Hence, you end up with a society with a clash between two opposed and entrenched cultures, motivated by completely different moral versions of what good life is, and governed by very different feeding rules. So that's the history of the culture wars in America. As I've already said, cultural division in Britain does not revolve around the church or related topics like abortion. Nevertheless, there are many parallels between the UK and the US. In exactly the same post-war decades, up until the same year, 1963, there's even a very famous poem by Philip Larkin about that. 1963 was the year sexual intercourse began. Up until that point, there was a conformist normative Britain characterised by social solidarity, fairly traditional gender roles, universal male employment, and rising living standards. But we also had a social revolution in the 60s which changed social life in Britain very rapidly. Again, as in the US, feminism was probably the most successful social movement in terms of how extensively it has transformed gender roles in Britain. This social revolution was not imposed from above, but is in response to not just young people's demands for a better, more fulfilling life, but also to their parents' desire for their kids to have more opportunities than they themselves had. Therefore, the Robbins report, published in 1963, recommended the expansion of the universities, and then 2 years later, in 1965, a government white paper made comprehensive schooling into the national policy. As someone who was born in 1965, I'm certainly glad of both of those developments, because my parents left school at 15 and 16, respectively, but I was able to stay on to the sixth form at my comprehensive and then eventually do my undergraduate degree at Essex, my postgraduate degrees at Sussex, both of them 1960s plate clerks, universities founded as a result of the Robin report, and then for the last 17 years I've taught in this one here, which is another 1960s university. We tend to think of the culture wars as people tweeting nasty comments at each other, but the actual nuts and bolts of it are government reports and papers and arguments and the building of education systems and you know, it's a longer historical process. The 1960s severed the remaining causal connection between class and educational achievement, at least to some extent, for a while. Despite the famous comedy sketch featuring John Cleese and the two Ronnies, no one had to know their place anymore. In the words of the historian John Lawrence, a shift in the worldview of the British working class from habit to self-reflection became dominant from the 1960s onwards. As a consequence, many people wanted to move beyond traditional social norms and live freer and more emotionally fulfilling social lifestyles. The 1970s was a volatile decade, both politically and socially. But when I started at my local comprehensive in 1976, Britain was the most socially equal country in the world, according to some metrics. Of course, that didn't last that long. During her 11 years in power, Margaret Thatcher's proclamations of the virtue of traditional Victorian values was a cultural war response to the new post-1960s culture, which had emerged from the straitjacket of normative Britain. As was her declaration that there's no such thing as society, there are individual men and women and families, implying that people should be self-reliant and not look to the government or the welfare state to support them. Folk wisdom has it that Thatcher won the economic argument, but the left won the cultural war. It's a bit more complicated than that, but the upshot was, as in the US, but by the 1990s, it was clear that the new identities that had emerged in the 1960s were not going away. In the US, the churches and the Republican Party provided a traditional structure of feeling to support those opposed to the new social movements. In Britain, this wasn't an option, so we might expect cultural division to have disappeared, swept under the carpet by sort of vague liberalism, which is perhaps what appeared to be the case during the late 1990s and early 2000s, but then they returned as if from nowhere in 2016. What happened in the meantime? Well, I can tell you on St George's Day, Englishness happened. According to Henderson and Wynne Jones, in 1992, people in England described themselves as British rather than English by a ratio of 2 to 1. So about a third of people said they were English. By 2011, people in England were more likely to describe themselves as English. So in less than 20 years, the English proportion went from about a third to over half, to a majority. Repeated survey evidence shows that this is an enduring change and that Englishness is here and here to stay. The result is that there is an available structure of feeling now to support those who want to align themselves with the traditional values that characterise the normative Britain of the immediate post-war decades. English identifiers are more likely to cite the monarch literature, sacrifices in world wars and countryside, whereas British identifiers are more likely to be proud of openness to other cultures and faiths, as well as the shared institutions such as the NHS. The result, outside the big cities, is a small c conservative culture which values a traditional English way of life and supports a law and order approach to maintain that status quo, which would include economic stability as well. Therefore, in this respect, the UK is actually very similar to the US, apart from the fact that this structure of feeling is neither tied to the church nor is directly to a political party, as is the case with the Republican Party in the States. As a consequence, English identifiers are not completely resistant to social change, and we don't get the culture wars at the same polarised intensity as in the US. But there is still a difference between people's emotional identities which we ignore at our peril. And now, as I'm kind of heading towards a conclusion, in 2022, in the 39th annual report of the British Social Attitudes Survey, which was subtitled Culture Wars, Keeping the Brexit Divide Alive, the authors noted that Leavers and Remainers diverge on culture war issues in line with what they, the authors, consider to be authoritarian, socially conservative, and libertarian, socially liberal outlooks. They consider a wide range of data before concluding that there does appear to be a potential for culture war issues to maintain the electoral division between Remainers and Leavers that is central to how people voted in the 2019 general election. Therefore, people are going to continue to try and do that, politicians, because it seems possible to do so according to the data. However, the authors of this report went on to note that the one thing that might stop that election result being endlessly repeatable forever is because the divide between libertarian and authoritarian outlooks, there's a long-term trend towards liberalisation across the board. In fact, in the more recent, I'm going to skip over what John Curtis says there, but in the more recent 40th report, which came out last year, September 23, the headline data showed quite sweeping liberalisation over that period. So, for example, a couple to live together before marriage is now supported by 81% rather than 64% in '94. 67% think a same-sex relationship is never wrong, compared with 17% in 1983. That's a huge shift. Similarly, 76% now think it's a completely a woman's right to choose abortion, up from 37% in 1983. That's another huge social shift. However, there's one reason which gives John Curtis, who's actually the author of that part of the report, cause to argue that it would be a mistake to think that Britain will simply continue to become more liberal. And is that the data shows that government pressure in alignment with the media has managed to impinge on public support for trans rights. The report summarises how attitudes towards people who are transgender have become markedly less liberal over the past 3 years. So since, in 2019, 82% of people describe themselves as not at all prejudiced against people who are transgender. In 3 years, that went down to 64%. In 2019, 53% of people said that someone should be able to have the sex on their birth certificate changed. That's gone down over 3 years to 30%. While women, younger people, the more educated and less religious, express more liberal views towards people who are transgender, these views have declined across all demographic groups. However, it's still the case that 71% of women describe themselves as not at all prejudiced against people who are transgender, compared with 57% of men. I mean, the first thing to say is that these figures are still much, much more supportive than anything you will ever read in the media, and that should be borne in mind. However, as the author of this report argues, these changes in attitudes are substantial, and their direction and timing suggest that they have been largely triggered by the intense political debate and media discussion on both sides of the border regarding the easing of the circumstances in which someone can be diagnosed as transgender. By both sides of the border, it's referring to the act of the UK government to stop user Section 35 order to overrule the Scottish Gender Recognition Bill of 2022. This had the double appeal to social conservatives of being anti-Scottish and reinforcing traditional binary sex essentialism. The author of the report goes on to argue that we may be seeing a period effect similar to that which we witnessed in the 1980s for attitudes to homosexual relationships with the emergence of AIDS and the introduction of Section 28, which you'll remember was a ban of the so-called promotion of homosexuality by local authorities and in schools. When those things were brought in 1988, it lowered the support, British support for same-sex relationships to 10%, which is the lowest level it's ever been. As I said, it's now back up to 67%. What this shows is that government, sustained government action can have an effect on social attitudes, and it almost looks as though the current government, like the Thatcherite government, actually, use these powers to advocate a self-conscious reactionary identity as part of their political appeal to voters. So in this respect, the culture war in the UK is returning in a circle to the Thatcherite position of validating repressive authoritarian government to enforce a normative Britain. However, that didn't work then, and the current Conservative government is so weak and unstable that it's unlikely to work now. At least it's unlikely to work in their favour, anyway. So, okay, I've got one more slide, which is a very quick conclusion, which is what can we expect in the near future? Well, we can expect more political chaos, I'm afraid to say, because the election campaign has already started and it's just going to be completely crazy until that's resumed. Despite this report that appeared at the weekend saying UK voters are frustrated with politicians employing desperate culture war tactics, we probably are going to see more superficial culture wars, certainly in the media, because that seems to be the kind of clickbait policy of certainly of the Murdoch press. We are going to also see more books on England. We've got two examples here. Caroline Lucas's Another England, which came out a couple of days ago, and Tom Baldwin and Mark Steers. Tom Baldwin is the biographer of Keir Starmer, if you don't know who he is. That book is coming out, I think, tomorrow or the day after, so they're both coming out for St George's Day, if you like. Both attempts trying to rewrite the story of England, a bit like George Orwell was trying to do in 1941, and give us a more progressive version, because I think it has finally got through to the left that this is a kind of necessary activity to do. But finally, there's going to be more social change and the continuation of the deeper historical culture war. Because the 1960s revolution hasn't run its course yet. People are still finding freer and more satisfying ways to live. The continuing growth of English identification as a means of maintaining the structural feeling of a traditional English way of life is itself an ongoing reaction to this ongoing social change. These two emotional realities are going to continue evolving in tandem, and it makes no sense to sweep that under the carpet. Much better for us to appreciate what's going on and try and find ways of talking to each other than to imagine it can just be kind of magically waved away. Okay, thank you very much.